Dyke, and I just wanted to do a quick video this morning on free speech, actually, and wanted to also just dig into something I'm getting into right now, and that's I'm getting into people engaging with Tim Keller, um, and this guy John Harris does a great job of it. Tim Keller is a problem, um, and the more I learn about him, uh, the more problematic he is, and the more I see his influence over everything in our church, PCA, and in things like the Gospel Coalition and in evangelicalism in general. And that is a problem because he has, if you look at the video, what happened to Tim Keller, you find out that his influences, um, what happened. Uh, Sorry, I've got a broken finger, so my typing is not. Um, if you go to this, you can just listen to his basic bio of him. It's not a fancy. It's not a fancy documentary, but it goes through his influences, and he was radically influenced by Marxists or people that were what they called the New Left in the 70s. A guy named Harvey Kahn at Westminster, and then even at Gordon Conwell, there was a student there that was a black radical. Anyways, he was very influenced by that stuff, and he basically broke it down, and that's why you're going to hear a lot of philosophers come out of his mouth. And when you hear philosophers and sociologists, that particularly the sociologists, when you hear Charles Taylor or sociologists or Heidegger or Foucault, who by the way was engaged with teenage boys in prostitution in Africa. When you hear of those names, your red flags should go up. Absolutely, they should go up and go, why am I listening to philosophers, to the New York Times, to the Atlantic, to what's the one uh, out of New York City that people always quote, and it's this think tank that's filled with people from Soros. Um, anyways, so just be aware that when you're not hearing the Bible, there's a reason you're not hearing the Bible, because they're viewing the Bible through a lens, and that's a problem. That's a problem. Let's read Micah about free, pretty radical stuff, and yet at the end of it, you'll be very surprised. In the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and people stream to it. And many nations will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Then he will judge between many peoples and arbitrate for strong nations far and wide. Then they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will no longer take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Nor each man will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree, with no one to frighten him, for the mouth of the Lord of the hosts has spoken. Though each of the peoples may walk in the name of his God, yet we will walk in the name of the Lord our God. So, right here, by the way, there's some problems with this, right? You're reading about this and you're thinking heaven, but this is not heaven. Notice it says each one will walk in the name of his God, yet we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. Also, it says teaching will come out of Jerusalem. Um, right here, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. Now, at one point in time in Scripture, it says you won't have to teach anybody, because everyone will know the Lord. Uh, say to his neighbor, say to your neighbor, know the Lord. Um, okay, let's look this up. Jeremiah, no longer will any man teach his neighbor or his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquities and will remember their sin no more. So we have two different futures. We have a future when no one will be told, you should know the Lord. Okay? No one will be told that, because everyone will know the Lord from the east, and this goes on from here, right? But we have this also, this great time. The mountain of the Lord will be established as chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples, the nations, will stream to it. So we have God as the Holy One as preeminent in the world, but amongst the gods, amongst the worshipers of the other gods. Okay? And yet we have another future. And why do I bring this up? I bring this up because of free speech. How do I get free speech from this? Believe it or not, this is a time in which people are the house of the Lord will be established as chief of the mountains, the best, the most preeminent. And yet what is here? It's not the people of the Lord marching out to battle to make everyone worship the Lord. It is actually saying, though each of the peoples may walk in the name of his God. So you'll notice in the scriptures when you read it, that when strangers, aliens, sojourners walk through Israel, they are not stopped at the border and told, you will either convert to Judaism or you will die. That's not how it is. Now, you are not allowed to put up a temple, and you are not allowed to, do things that are cultic practices, but you are not forced to know the Lord, and you are not forced to convert. Okay, so this is one of the places that I find free speech. Of course, I would find free speech in the Garden of Eden, where people were, right, because God could have made it so they couldn't change their minds, they couldn't sin against God. But what we have is we have a radical freedom, a freedom I think that is upsetting. I think it's upsetting even to the spiritual forces, and I think that there's freedom amongst the spiritual beings, the sort of quote unquote the angels, but the angel of course is a messenger. It's rather the cherubs and the seraphim. So I think we have freedom of choice, freedom of speech, and that should not be curtailed. And when the government tries to do that, and someone comes along with hate speech laws and stuff like that, you should go. Your alarm bells should go off, because they are doing more than God did. And and by the way, those hate speech laws, of course, are being used against Christians in Canada, where, for instance, a chapter like Romans chapter 1 is. You cannot preach Romans chapter 1 in Canada, I don't think, without incurring the wrath of the governments. So, and other places where things that we believe, for instance, the exclusion of the exclusive claims of Christianity, could be outlawed as quote unquote disinformation, malinformation, or just wrong think, right? The wrath of God being revealed from heaven against all godliness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. And later on it gets into unnatural relationships. This is stuff that will be considered hate speech. It'll be considered violence. And so free speech is something we're going to have to depend on. And it's the only way, of course, the gospel will get out, especially, for instance, in a communist country where atheism would be the truth rolled out by the government, or socialism, by the way, which could become totalitarian, because socialism is only communism's younger brother. It hasn't grown up into communism yet. It will. All right, that is my little take on free speech actually being biblical. All right, Randy Van Dyke, out.